The topic of women in ministry is a complex and often contentious issue, and opinions on it can vary widely depending on cultural, religious, and personal perspectives. While many people believe that women should be allowed to serve in all roles of ministry, others may argue that there are negative impacts based on their interpretation of religious texts, cultural traditions, or historical precedents. Some arguments presented by those who oppose women in ministry often include interpretation of Scripture. Some opponents believe that certain biblical passages prohibit women from holding leadership positions within the church. For example, verses like 1 Timothy 2:12, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man," are cited to argue that men should hold the primary leadership roles in ministry. Traditional gender roles. In some communities, there is a deeply ingrained belief in traditional gender roles that view men as the primary leaders, both in the home and in the church. Those who hold this view argue that women in ministry may disrupt the established order or cause confusion about roles within the church and family. Cultural and social impact. In some contexts, having women in ministry might challenge cultural norms and expectations. In certain societies, women in leadership may be viewed as threatening to social stability or as disrespectful to traditions that have been in place for generations. Divisiveness. Some argue that the inclusion of women in pastoral or leadership positions could cause division within congregations. Different denominations or communities may have opposing views on this topic, and the decision to allow women in ministry may lead to schisms or splits within churches. Undermining male leadership. Some argue that women in ministry could overshadow or undermine the leadership of men in the church, which they believe could disrupt the intended structure of spiritual guidance and leadership. The argument about women in ministry undermining male leadership often stems from the belief that certain traditional roles within the church are meant to be held by men, especially in leadership positions such as pastors, elders, and deacons. This argument is rooted in the interpretation of biblical teachings, cultural traditions, and the concept of male headship within the church and family. Here's a more in-depth look at the argument that women in ministry could undermine male leadership. Biblical interpretation of male headship, Ephesians 5:22 through 24, and 1 Corinthians 11:3, are key passages used by some who believe in male leadership within the church. These verses emphasize the idea of male headship in marriage and, by extension, in the church. Some proponents argue that this hierarchy should be reflected in the church's leadership structure. In this context, they believe that male leadership is not just a cultural preference, but a divinely ordained structure. Allowing women to take on leadership roles in the church, such as preaching, pastoring, or holding authoritative positions, is seen as a deviation from this order. Theological concerns. Some critics believe that women in leadership roles can cause confusion about spiritual authority, especially when it comes to teaching, doctrine, and decision-making. From this viewpoint, the presence of women in leadership might blur the lines of who holds ultimate authority within the church. The concern is that the Bible teaches a male spiritual authority in roles like the pastorate, and that giving women such authority could weaken the spiritual oversight that male leaders are meant to provide. The impact on church structure. In many conservative or traditional communities, the male pastor is seen as the spiritual leader of the congregation. Allowing women to take on this role could be perceived as disrupting this structure, which is believed to function best when men lead. The concern is that the male leadership could be seen as less important or unnecessary if women are allowed to assume similar leadership roles. Some argue that when women take leadership positions in the church, it might shift the focus away from male leaders and diminish their influence. This could lead to less respect for male authority or make male leadership seem less essential, ultimately altering the structure of the church and its practices. Gender dynamics in ministry. In some traditions, male leadership in ministry is believed to be essential to maintaining a masculine model of spiritual authority. Male leaders may be seen as better able to represent the masculine qualities of God, such as strength, leadership, and authority. From this perspective, allowing women in leadership could be seen as introducing a feminine dynamic that detracts from the perceived strength or authority of the church's leadership. Some also feel that if women are allowed to lead, it could lead to the normalization of gender fluidity or a diminished understanding of the distinct roles of men and women. For these individuals, the idea of male leadership is tied to the identity of the church, and they believe that anything that challenges or changes that identity undermines its mission and values. Cultural and sociological factors. Historically, many churches and religious institutions have been patriarchal with clearly defined gender roles. In some cases, the idea of male leadership is closely tied to broader cultural and social norms about gender. In these contexts, allowing women to take on leadership roles in the church is seen as a challenge not only to religious teachings, but also to societal norms about gender roles. Critics often argue that allowing women to lead in the church could encourage broader societal shifts toward egalitarianism or the breaking down of traditional gender roles, which they see as destabilizing to both the church and society at large. Fear of weakening male role models. One of the concerns raised by those who oppose women in ministry is that women in leadership might reduce the number of male role models in the church. The idea is that young boys, particularly in conservative communities, need male role models who represent godly masculinity. If women are in leadership positions, these critics worry it could confuse young boys about what it means to be a strong, godly man and could reduce the influence of male mentors. In these contexts, the church may feel that the primary spiritual example for young men should be another man, not a woman, in order to affirm their sense of identity and role in the church and family. Concerns about authority and respect. Some traditionalists argue that there is a lack of respect for male authority when women take on leadership positions in the church. The concern is that men, particularly in conservative circles, might struggle to accept women in positions of spiritual authority or pastoral care. If male leaders or congregants feel that women should not hold these positions, it may lead to conflict, resentment, or division within the church. The belief is that a man's authority should be respected in both the church and the family, and allowing women to step into leadership roles can potentially disrupt that respect, leading to a loss of the clear spiritual order they feel should exist. Theological and doctrinal purity. In certain denominations or churches, the argument for male leadership is closely tied to their doctrine and theology. These communities may feel that their specific theological beliefs about gender roles are central to their identity and purpose. If women are allowed to preach or lead in the church, some believe that it could dilute or distort the teachings and practices that have been passed down. The fear is that introducing women into leadership could lead to doctrinal shifts that stray from what they understand to be biblically correct, potentially leading to theological compromises and even theological division within the church. The belief that women in ministry undermine male leadership is based on theological interpretations that emphasize male headship, traditional gender roles, and a hierarchical structure in the church. While many people support women in ministry and leadership roles, others argue that it disrupts established structures and principles. This debate often reflects broader conversations about gender, authority, and the role of the church in society. Ultimately, it is a conversation shaped by differing views on Scripture, culture, and the evolving nature of ministry. Lack of biblical precedent. Critics sometimes assert that there are few, if any, examples of women serving in the same leadership roles as men within the early church. They may view this as evidence that the tradition of male leadership in ministry should continue. However, it's important to note that these arguments are not universally accepted, and there are many proponents of women in ministry who argue that these points are either misinterpretations of Scripture or reflect outdated cultural attitudes. They assert that the Bible supports the active involvement of women in all areas of ministry, citing examples of women leaders, teachers, and prophets in both the Old and New Testaments.